this episode, we talk to Dr. Nick Gordon about the Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral, made in the 12th century for the relics of the Three Wise Men. It's a masterpiece of medieval metalsmithing and one of the few surviving works by Nicholas of Verdun. Its 74 sculpted figures, over 1,000 gems, ancient cameos and inlaid enamels also make it one of the finest examples of medieval goldsmithing, sculpture and jewellery making. Thanks very much for coming in today. What object have you chosen for us to talk about?
Well, today I thought it would be interesting if we talk about the Shrine of the Three Kings by Nicholas of Verdun, which is in Cologne Cathedral today.
And can you begin perhaps by describing it for those who are listening along?
Sure. So what we're looking at is an immense reliquary, so immense in fact that it's just over 220 centimetres long, 153 centimetres high, and over a metre wide. It's in a particularly interesting shape. It's designed to look like a Romanesque cathedral. So we have a central section that rises up to be the nave, and then we have the two aisles on the lower section coming out the side. It's almost entirely covered with gold and silver gilding, and it's encrusted with more than 1,000 gems, all sorts of different types of enamel, and more than 70 high-relief sculptures of evangelists, apostles, and scenes from the life of Christ.
This is an amazing work, especially because of its materiality, which you've just listed for us, all of the different luxury materials that this object is created from. But you've referred to it as a shrine and as a reliquary. So whose relics are preserved inside this object?
Well, inside it are the relics of the three kings, who came to visit Jesus shortly after his birth, carrying the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that also is reflected in the bizarre shape, because this is actually three sarcophagi that have been joined together to look like a church, one for each of those three kings.
So inside this object that is shaped to look like a Romanesque basilica, you're saying there are three caskets with three separate caskets with the relics of three separate traditional figures.
Exactly, yes.
It's extraordinary just by reason of its size alone. Those three kings, we're told in the Gospel, came from the east. So if they came from the east, how did they end up in Cologne Cathedral?
Well, initially they'd been brought to Milan. The Milan was once a major centre of Christianity in Western Europe, and a former capital of the Roman Empire. They ended up, though, in Cologne when Frederick Barbarossa in the Middle Ages was trying to exert authority over northern Italy, came down with his army and he sacked Milan and stole the relics. And he took those relics back into the Holy Roman Empire, and he gifted them to the Archbishop of Cologne, who was one of his key supporters.
I mean, I've seen the sarcophagus associated with the relics of the three kings in Milan, where they preserved these relics before they were, quote unquote, removed from Milan to Cologne. That's a really humble, modest work of sculpture, very beautiful, but a humble work of sculpture in stone in comparison with this object. Can you tell us a little bit more about the making of this object? What's gone into its construction?
Well, firstly, it is made of the basic structure is made of oak, and then you have that oak structure made for each of the sarcophagi, and then over the top of that you have all of the gilding that we see, these different gilded compartments. Some of these required the oak to be carved before the gilding was put on. We then have each of those 74 individual high-relief sculptures here as well. So they're made of metal, and then they're each individually gilded before they're then attached in each of those little archways. Interestingly, when you look more closely at those, these are not necessarily what you would expect of kind of art from the 12th century. in that these figures are quite naturalistic. Each of the figures, rather than having a hieratic expression, has an individual face with individual features. Their robes tend to flow. They're actually highly classicizing, although they're from the 12th century. So you have the artist creating those. But then on top of that, because Nicholas of Verdun was also not just a sculptor, he's also a goldsmith. He's then kind of putting in all of these gemstones, all of these kind of wonderful, I suppose, an encrustation of gemstones right around it. And then on top of that, you would have somebody else producing all of the enamel pieces, which kind of reinforce the architecture of this structure over the archways, up the columns, along kind of if this were a building, the structural elements of it are encrusted with these enamels. So they would have been made by somebody else, but it would have been up to Nicholas of Verdun and his workshop to make them all work and all fit in perfectly in this very blingy but ultimately harmonious structure.
It's an extraordinary kind of luxury exoskeleton for the objects inside it. And let's not forget in a moment to talk about the kind of person who is able to commission and pay for a work such as this. But while we're speaking about Nicholas of Verdun, the person to whom this work is attributed, can you tell us more about him? Who was he?
Well, he's a person we don't know very much about, although he seems to have been kind of the favoured artist for the most powerful people in the later 12th century, at least north of the Alps. So we have very, very little information about him except for the sorts of works of his that have survived. And there are 3 principal works of his that have survived, which are all like this or of a similar quality. There's the one here, there's another reliquary in Cologne Cathedral, and then there is an altarpiece he made, which is now in a Kloster Neuburg just outside of Vienna. But beyond those 3 major works, there's only a couple of smaller pieces of attributed sculpture that we know about him. So we have his masterpieces, very little documentary evidence about who he was, where he came from. We just see the proof of his master craftsmanship.
Yeah, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that. So in order to be able to coordinate a workshop of variously skilled artisans who can make these different types of objects, who know how to set gems, who know how to cast statuettes out of gold and silver, who can place works in enamel, plaquettes in enamel made by someone else. What kind of a person must he have been in order to direct a workshop that can produce this?
I think he would have been an exceptionally good project manager, in that he has to coordinate numerous people who are coming from numerous different trades. He no doubt has a very tight deadline to be able to produce this. This was commissioned by the Archbishop of Cologne, one of the most powerful people north of the Alps in the 12th and 13th centuries. So it was a major work. He also works for other people of a similar status. So he would need to be able to deliver the works at a very high quality on time. He was probably not responsible for deciding which of the saints or which of the apostles, which of the scenes of the life of Christ would be placed where. He would probably they could have an advisor from the Archbishop or his patron, we think, probably telling him we need this saint, this saint, this saint. But then it's basically up to him to kind of capture, I suppose, the what that saint would look like. And to be able to do it. So if you're making 74 sculptures of saints and each one looks different, then he's obviously had to think about kind of, well, what's the iconography of this saint? What's the character of this saint? And how do we represent that through their face, through their body, through their clothing? So that part would be left to him as well, the design work, once he's given the idea and what they want. A bit like, say, an architect working with a non-architect patron. The patron will tell them lots of stuff, but the architect has to figure out what that actually looks like. So that would be part of his job here too.
But yet, because we're attributing this work just to his name as a person, just to his name as the artist, he is also a maker. He is capable of executing this kind of work himself as well.
Yes. So he's primarily known in terms of the parts of this that he would have made, other than overseeing the whole project. Primarily the sculptural parts of it would have where he is. So he's a sculptor and goldsmith who is also running a large workshop and coordinating other master craftsmen.
You've said that the patron for this work was the Archbishop of Cologne Cathedral, someone who was in a position of great power and authority and wealth, essentially, not just a prince of the church at this point in the Middle Ages, but also someone with real power in the city in which he's established. One of the things that's really intriguing about this work, I think, is that we still get to see it inside Cologne Cathedral. And I think most people looking at a work of medieval craft, something that we would describe as a decorative art form, we're most used to seeing those inside dusty vitrines in museums, kind of tucked away. It's reasonably rare to see an object like this still in the place for which it was designed. So can you tell us a little bit about how this object actually functioned for the viewers who would have seen it after it was installed in the 12th century in the cathedral?
Sure. So we know that this reliquary attracted a huge number of pilgrims to Cologne. And at the time, as you mentioned, kind of the Archbishop of Cologne was also a secular ruler. He was a prince bishop, one of these bizarre positions in the Holy Roman Empire. So he's a secular ruler as well as a spiritual ruler. And in that sense, this work here is reflecting, I suppose, indirectly reflecting his glory and his taste, his magnificence. And he's getting people to come to this with these relics, pilgrims coming from around Europe to visit the shrine. So a new cathedral was begun for this. So so many people were coming, they needed more space to be able to have people come in and see it. It was down towards the back behind where the high altar would normally have been, in a wide kind of ambulatory that was built around the back. So you would be able to process around the edge of the church, around the back, behind where the choir would normally be, to be able to get up close to seeing this object. Today it is still in that position, except unlike in the Middle Ages, now it's enclosed within a bulletproof glass and air climate-controlled box. So it's hard to get good photos of today because of the glass, but you can still get up close and really look at the details of it.
So it's perfectly placed to kind of maximize the central role that these relics play in a spiritual sense, but also to not disturb the other business of the cathedral for a large group of people who want to walk around the perimeter of the cathedral and get a good look at its holiest objects before leaving without disturbing the faithful at Mass in the building.
Yeah, but on that, actually, as a point of curiosity, today, when you do that and you walk around, you can go around and see it, you get the sense of it being a complete church. However, much of the church was only finished in the 19th century, so they finished the area around the high altar, the transept, the ambulatory, but then most of the nave wasn't completed because the Archbishop of Cologne got booted out of Cologne by the burghers of Cologne halfway through the construction of the cathedral, and the burghers didn't want the representation of the Archbishop's power to be completed. And so it was not until the 19th century that you could actually go from the entry of the church around the edge. You had to kind of go through the church, walk through this wide open space with no roof, and then get down to the ambulatory where you could see this work.
One imagines that some of the funds for the construction of the cathedral might also have been caught up in the production of an object this expensive as well. Maybe just by way of conclusion, I think another thing that's staggering about a work such as this one is that it survives at all. So can you tell us why, over the many centuries that have elapsed between the making of this work in the 12th century and how we are able to view it in the 21st century in Cologne Cathedral, why was this not broken down at some point in time for the extraordinary sum of its parts?
It's a good question. It's partly that it is being recognised as a masterpiece since it was created. So it wasn't thought of as just an ordinary reliquary. We can just melt that one down, or that one's gone that one's a bit tarnished. We can turn that into the king's new tableware. So this one, because it was recognised as a masterpiece, but it was valued in its own right. So that partly explains why it wasn't melted down or kind of chipped away at. Unlike other parts of Europe as well, Cologne enjoyed relative stability, so you don't have things like French revolutionaries tearing things apart. coming through Cologne. And during the 20th century as well, works like this were all kind of tucked away underground during times of war to make sure that they weren't destroyed. So it's survived because it was recognized as a work of art, and because Cologne has been, compared to other parts of Europe, has enjoyed more stability across the 13th to the 19th century.
Well, aren't we the luckier that it has been preserved and that we can admire its extraordinary manufacture today? Thanks very much, Nick.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.